Hi, I'm John, one of the pastors here. They say that actions speak louder than words. That's probably true. Still, it seems that words sometimes have the ability to capture a person's essence. Words can serve as a powerful representation of who we are, what we believe, and the values we live and breathe. My father-in-law is full of pithy bits of practical wisdom. One of my favorites is, you can have anything you want, you just can't have everything you want. Well, you probably can't have anything, but with many things in life, if you want it badly enough, you can probably get it. But every dream has a built-in price tag. I remember a business CEO who was honest enough to say that he'd like to believe that his family came first, but he couldn't honestly say that. He wanted to be CEO and he wanted to be a great family man. He just couldn't do both. He had to make a choice. Like my father-in-law said, you can have anything you want. You just can't have everything you want. Well, you probably can't have anything, but with many things in life, if you want it badly enough, you can probably get it. But every dream has a built-in price tag. I remember a business CEO who was honest enough to say that he'd like to believe that his family came first, but he couldn't honestly say that. He wanted to be CEO and he wanted to be a great family man. He just couldn't do both. He had to make a choice. Like my father-in-law said, you can have anything you want. You just can't have everything you want. As I look at my father-in-law's life, I can see how he lived by these words. I see how he made his family a priority. I see how he made his faith a priority. I see how he chose a good neighborhood and old friends over having a nicer house. I can see how he chose good friendships over a life of prospecting for business contacts. And when I think about my own dad, more than anything, I remember him saying, if there's anything I can't stand, it's a bully. My father was so adamant on this issue that it mattered more to him than friendship. In high school, he ended up in a fist fight with one of his best friends in order to stop him from picking on a weaker kid. It's no surprise that my dad became a teacher, and he was always willing to reach out to the troubled kids. My dad's words taught me to always stick up for the underdog. That's probably why he didn't get upset when I didn't back down from a fight with the class bully on freshman religious retreat day at a Catholic high school. Words to live by. What values are you passing on to the next generation through your words? Perhaps even more poignant than words to live by are words to die by. Famous last words. A person's dying words are considered so important because they have nothing left to lose. If you could say just one last thing, surely it would be the most important thing you could think of. If nothing else, a person's dying words have the potential to be very revealing. Here are some famous last words. Marie Antoinette. She was the last queen of France. On her way to execution, stepping toward the guillotine, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner and uttered these words, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." Ever the lady. Next we have P.T. Barnum, the famous circus promoter whose life is fancifully portrayed in the movie The Greatest Showman. He's much more handsome in the movie, no? Even to his dying breath, he was still fixated on making more money, asking, how were the circus receipts in Madison Square Garden? Next we have Dominique Bouhours. He was a Jesuit grammarian who worked endlessly to promote a high standard of correctness and purity in the French language. His fitting last words were, I am about to, or I am going to, die. Either expression is used. Thank you for that clarification. Next up we have George Hegel. He was a German philosopher who was famously difficult to understand, a fact that he clearly knew about himself, saying, only one man ever understood me, and he really didn't understand me. As a philosophy undergrad, I was told that graduate students were given the task of translating Hegel into English as a form of torture. Well, if you've ever stayed at a Hilton hotel, you have a connection to this next person, Conrad Hilton. He worked his way up from the bottom to eventually create the Hilton Hotel dynasty. In some circles, he's more famous for being Paris Hilton's great-grandfather. When he was asked if he had any final bits of wisdom to impart, he spoke this gem: "Leave the shower curtain on the inside of the tub." Whatever else might be said of him, he certainly was focused. And finally, Pancho Villa. He was a rebel against the Mexican government for many years. Eventually, he was granted amnesty, but was assassinated by supporters of his longtime enemy, General Obregon. Pancho Villa knew the importance of leaving a legacy, so as reporters gathered around him while he was dying, he tried to say something memorable. Tragically, all he could come up with was, "Don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something." Well, at least it's memorable. How would you like to be remembered? If you had a last chance to impart some final wisdom, would you have the words to say, or, like Pancho Villa, would words fail you? If you had one last chance to leave a legacy, one last opportunity to make things right, what would you say? Would you tell people that you love them? Would you ask for forgiveness? Would you grant forgiveness? What would you say to your friends, your spouse, your children? Would you express your regrets, your dreams for the future? Perhaps there's a central lesson or a guiding principle that you would absolutely want to ensure was remembered. Would the way you had lived your life speak clearly without words? Would the choices you have made speak for themselves? Or are there some clarifications you would like to make if given the chance? Much like Pancho Villa, when it came time to die, Jesus knew the importance of having something valuable to say. But unlike Pancho, Jesus was better prepared. Today we are continuing a series called Love's Last Words that will take us through Lent all the way to Easter. In the 4 accounts from the Gospels, Jesus is seen making the effort to speak not just 1, but 7 important words from the cross. Let's turn our attention to today's word of love from the cross. In John 19 it says, "When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son,' and to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.' From that time on, this disciple took her into his home." Jesus' word for us today is, "Here is your son, here is your mother." To sum it up in just one word, Jesus' word to us is family. Unlike Pancho Villa and unlike many of us, Jesus was prepared for this moment. He knew when he was going to die. He knew why he was going to die. He even knew how he was going to die. Quite literally, Jesus was born to die. And from day one, he made himself ready. Although Jesus found the opportunity to speak 7 incredibly important words to us, we shouldn't think that he was especially chatty that day. But in the midst of his incredible declarations of forgiveness, forlorn prayers of suffering, and the assurances of a life in the hereafter, Jesus took a very human moment to speak a word of comfort to his mother Mary. "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, who is very likely John, "Here is your mother. You are now family. John, I will soon be gone. Take good care of her." This scene is a powerful one, filled with incredible contrasts. On the one hand, you have false powers playing a game of false accusations. Pilate, the Roman governor, puts false accusations above Jesus' head in order to mock the Jewish priests who forced his hand. In contrast, Jesus, the true king, is crucified, speaking truth and praying for his enemies. You have 4 soldiers taking great care not to damage a simple garment. In contrast, you have 4 disciples at the foot of the cross concerned more about the torn body that once wore that garment. The women at the foot of the cross is an especially powerful image. Peter and James and the other disciples were all in hiding. in fear for their lives. But these women were out in broad daylight, standing by the condemned man, Jesus, accompanied by John, probably the youngest of the disciples. While the rest of the disciples were crouching and huddled in fear, these women and John were standing in the open, standing with Jesus. Many people have wondered how these women and John found the courage to stand with him. Were they especially brave? Did they love Jesus more than the others did? Perhaps. But as many Middle Eastern observers have noted, until recently, women and children were generally free to travel through areas where grown men might have been killed. Even today, women and children are often allowed safe passage through areas of the Middle East where men might be in danger. One observer reported from the middle of a Lebanese civil war that there were rival militias stalking the streets, men moving in armed groups, taking control of streets and buildings, but somehow women were free to come and go as they pleased. The assumption was that they were not combatants, and also that they needed to take care of their families, even to do some basic shopping. Even in civil war, someone has to make dinner. Likewise, children were seen as non-threatening. John was likely very young and not seen as a threat. And so this moving scene has been studied and meditated upon and painted many times. Throughout Lent, we will have meditation cards that will help you meditate on love's last words from the cross. And this week's card has a picture of the crucifixion by George Rouault, Christ on the cross. The body of Jesus dominates this painting, filling most of the space. Jesus' left arm almost reaches out to embrace Mary and John, who stand so closely together. While John and Mary are clearly both full of grief, the streaks of warm color communicate a sense of hope. We encourage you to take one of these cards to help you reflect upon this scene and this word of family. But as we reflect on Jesus' word about family, let's remember that he had broken open the meaning of that word to be something far richer than what many of us have experienced. Mary had other blood relatives. Jesus had brothers, or at least cousins, but they did not believe in Jesus until after the resurrection. What comfort would they have been to Mary in those pitiful days of waiting? Even if they had said nothing to Mary, I can imagine she could have guessed their thoughts. Perhaps thoughts like, I knew it would come to this, or this is all Jesus' fault, or look how he broke our mother's heart. Perhaps that's why Jesus turned to John, who was not a blood relative, and told him to care for Mary as his own mother. But Mary also had believing relatives. Mary's sister was at the cross with her, and her family would have had obligations to help her. But Jesus had a bigger definition of family. During his ministry, someone told Jesus that his family was there to see him, but Jesus responded, "My mother and brothers are those who hear God's word and put it into practice." Mary was not only Jesus' birth mother, she was also Jesus' disciple and part of that larger spiritual family. John, though not related by blood, was also a close disciple. And so by Jesus' reckoning, they were family, connected not by natural bloodlines, but connected by the blood of Christ shed at the cross. And right there at the cross, Jesus was making this connection explicit. Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. You are family. I experienced a taste of this kind of family when I was in high school and college. Here's an old pic of Sally Stites on the right, with me in the middle and my wife to the left. Amy and I were in our 20s out to see one of my high school group of friends get married. Sally, or Mrs. Stites as I knew her then, was like our group mom. Not only was she my best friend's mom, but she was at the center of the only view I had into Christian community and family at the time. We were over at their house all the time and we always felt welcome. I became a believer later in college, and I have no doubt about the power of her prayers. After becoming a believer, I started attending her church where she was the music director. I played piano for the choir. I watched their house when they were out of town. And when I was struggling with some deep emotional scars, she became the spiritual mom that I needed. Through her family and other believers, I began to learn how Jesus might be calling us to a larger experience of family. I'm part of a Facebook group with other pastors in our denomination, and last week, as you might expect, our conversation turned toward the horrible school tragedy in Florida. Now, there are many possible responses to such a tragedy, but at least one of them is to address the isolation and alienation that so many teenagers experience. One of the other pastors shared a response that I thought was particularly helpful. She shared that many teens were graduating from high school and leaving the church, and even in high school, many of the teens weren't showing up to church at all. As they met in one of their house groups and talked about what might be happening, various people had their theories. Some people thought that the problem was the culture. Others thought the issue was secular values. Perhaps it was a lack of biblical training and character formation in those teens. Others blamed the parents. One teen who had been listening quietly to this discussion finally spoke up and asked this question: how many teens can you identify by their first name in our youth group right now? The answer was stunning: none. Then the teen made this suggestion, saying, it all starts with relationships that listen and care. Ask any one of us or a group of us out to pizza. We will never turn down food. Ask us about our lives and listen. Don't try to fix us. Listen because you want to know what is shaping our lives. Listen because you want to love us right where we are. No one wants to come to a church where they aren't seen, valued, or heard. Well, if I can paraphrase, I think that teen was asking for them to do exactly what Jesus had done, to broaden the horizons of family. Your kids are our kids, and our kids are your kids, or at least they can be. At least one way we can respond to Jesus' word from the cross is to hear and respond to his call to be more of a family. Youth groups and youth programs like Kids Rock are good things, even great things. But research out of Fuller Youth Institute says that any program will always be a distant second to the importance of intergenerational relationships with parents and with other adults. That means if you're an adult, even if you have no natural or legal children of your own, you have an important role to play as a spiritual parent. Like that teen suggested in that group discussion, maybe it starts with an offer of food. Even from the cross, Jesus invites us into hospitality. Sally Stites always fed us. My father-in-law always stocked the fridge with cold drinks so that the neighborhood kids would come over to his house. Maybe it means you invite some of your children's friends the next time you go skiing, or to the beach, or out to dinner. Maybe it means helping out with scouts, or a high school club, or one of the team sports. I know that we're all busy and these things take time, but we're talking about making an eternal difference. We're talking about hearing and responding to the words of Jesus who said, "My mother and brothers are those who hear God's word and put it into practice." One of the most powerful examples I've seen of this idea being put into practice was by Bruce Feiler, best-selling author of Walk the Bible and A Council of Dads. Back in 2008, Bruce was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer. His twin daughters were only 3 years old at the time. While setting his affairs in order, the biggest challenge was how to leave a legacy for his daughters, girls who might grow up with no memory of their dad. He knew he couldn't do it alone. So he drafted 6 of his closest friends to become a council of dads. Each one of them had made a lasting imprint on who he was as a human being, and he wanted them to commit to passing on those same lessons to his daughters. He wasn't sure what they would say, but every last one of them said yes. It was a solemn oath, life and death stuff. Thank God, an experimental medicine and surgery saved his life and his leg. But the Council of Dads blessed his children, him, and his wife in a way that he couldn't have predicted. And he wrote his book, A Council of Dads, to encourage all of us to set up similar relational commitments. Maybe you aren't being boldly confronted by your physical mortality as Bruce was and as Jesus was. Wouldn't it be so much better if we could all learn these lessons without having to face our own mortality? I once heard a saying as a child that made a lasting imprint on me. Fools never learn, smart people learn from their mistakes, but the wise learn from the mistakes of others. Let's be wise. Like Mary said about her son Jesus, do whatever he tells you. We began today by considering the last words of some famous people before considering one of Jesus' last words from the cross. But I also asked you to consider what you might want your last words to be. Back on 9/11, when the Twin Towers came down, I remember hearing about the voice messages and text messages that were sent by some of the 3,000 people who didn't make it home that day. For those who understood what was happening, it seemed that the overwhelming majority of messages were simple messages of love. Melissa Hughes, who was in New York for only one day on business, was caught in one of the towers. She tried to get through to her husband Sean, but he was in San Francisco and still asleep. So her message went to voicemail. She said, "I just wanted to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York. There's lots of smoke, and I just wanted you to know that I love you always." What do you want your last words to be? What do you want people to remember about you when you're gone? At least one of the things Jesus wanted us to remember is to love one another like family, to take care of one another, to broaden our definition of family to include all who follow in his footsteps, and to invite others to be a part of that family as well. Some of us here are joined by a bond of blood and kin. Some of us are joined by legal relationships. Jesus didn't want to do away with those things. Instead, he wanted to broaden and deepen them into spiritual relationships that go far beyond. How will you respond? You might choose to reach out to the children all around you. I believe that this week's national crisis is ultimately rooted in the alienation and isolation that Jesus came to heal. Maybe you can start a healing connection that changes the next generation. Another response might be to strengthen those bonds where they already exist. At the very least, we can be thankful for the relationships that God has given us, those relationships where friends become like family, especially those intergenerational relationships. As I prepared today's message, I realized that I should start sending Mrs. Stites a Mother's Day card. Or maybe you're ready to learn the lesson that Bruce Feiler did when he created his Council of Dads. Whether or not you're ready to confront your own mortality, the truth is, the legacy you leave for your children will largely depend on the other adults in their lives, or the absence of those adults. Maybe it's time to invite trusted sisters and brothers to help you love your children more than you ever could alone. Before we enter a time of confession and assurance, I invite you to take the next few moments in silence to consider Jesus' word to you and to invite God's Holy Spirit to move your heart to respond.